Alrighty guys, how you doing today?
Great.
Fantastic. Well, my presentation today is going to be tying and fishing tailwater flies, which is going to follow my book a bit. And the primary emphasis is going to be not only tying the tailwater flies, but also how to fish them. So I think that's an important strategy when you visit your favorite tailwater fishery. We're going to start out with a midge larva pattern. A good healthy trout stream is going to have anywhere between 2,000 and 3,000 midge larvae per square meter of substrate. So larva patterns are very, very important for us as tailwater enthusiasts. This is a Tiemco 2487 hook, and this is going to be some light Cahill 8/0 thread. And typically what you'll find is pale olive larva and red larva, and I'm going to tie one of each. So I'm going to take some micro tubing here. This is the hairline micro tubing, clear, and we're going to secure that behind the eye of the hook, and then with symmetrical touching wraps, advance this back towards hook bend. Once we get back to hook bend, we'll advance this forward and hopefully lock down that little straggler piece there. One of the identifying features of larvae is they're very uniform throughout their worm-like body. So they look like little segmented tubes, and that's the beauty of this pattern. It's a very easy, effective fly. We call these little guys guide flies. A lot of the patterns that I tie aren't going to win any fly tying contest, but they're very simple but very effective. So we're going to advance this clear tubing forward towards the eye of the hook. Take a couple material locking wraps here to secure the tubing. And then one of the things that's prominent on midge larvae is their head. It can be easily identified and easily created by a few wraps of tying thread. So we're just going to wrap that around there, and then we're going to whip finish this off. So this is nothing more than what I refer to as a pale midge larva. Larvae are real effective when you're experience like a small flow increase. So I typically use my larva as an attractor fly, whether it be the pale olive or the red, and then I'll drop a pupa off it, okay? Typically dredge my larva a little bit closer to the substrate where the naturals are found, and I'll fish my pupa a little bit higher in the water column. So that's the pale olive larva. Now let's move into, yes sir?
You said tubing, you don't use the D-rib, you use tubing? You
could use D-rib, but I typically like the tubing better myself.
I haven't seen the tubing, that's what.
Yeah, it's Hairline's micro tubing.
Okay.
And you can buy it in a midge and you can buy it in a micro. The micro's smaller.
Okay.
But that's what I would recommend. And I can show you that here in a moment if you'd like. Now we'll move into a red larva. Red larvae are the larvae that live in the low oxygenated parts of a trout stream, often referred to as bloodworms or blood midges, mainly because they contain hemoglobin. That's an oxygen carrying pigment that allows them to live in this mud and muck in some of these siltier areas of a trout stream. So if you're fishing tailwaters like the San Juan, you're fishing the Green, you're fishing anywhere, the Bighorn, you're going to find a nice population of blood midges within those streams. This is a Tiemco 200R, and I'll put a little glass bead on there. A lot of my flies have what we call a mercury bead on it. This little bead simulates the gas bubble in the thorax of an emerging midge. So this becomes a trigger or just a lifelike portrayal of the actual emerging insect. This is 8/0 red thread, so we'll begin with a jam knot behind that. I typically tie these in sizes 18 through 22. Oftentimes it's a lead fly and a tandem nymphing rig, so it's my attractor, so very, very effective with that. Oftentimes in the shoulder seasons, a lot of anglers will opt to fish like an egg midge combo, egg Baetis combo. After the fish have gotten used to seeing a lot of egg patterns, I'll usually get rid of the egg pattern and I'll go with a red larva. It's a very, very effective strategy on a wide range of tailwater fisheries. I'm going to use some small UTC gold wire for the rib on this. Again, a very simple pattern, but no less effective. I've caught fish in just about any tailwater setting, from the Bighorn, San Juan, the Green, to my home waters on the South Platte with this pattern. So we're going to begin by attaching that gold wire on the top of the hook, and then just advancing that thread back towards hook bend. Once again, using symmetrical wraps, touching wraps right back towards the rear of the hook, and then we'll advance this thread back forward up towards the mercury bead itself. Then we're going to counter rib this, again trying to get a bit of segmentation. We don't want these to be touching wraps like a South Platte Brassy. We just want a little hint of segmentation here to indicate that this is a midge larva. The final step now will be to take a small bit of peacock. We're going to take a collar with the peacock here behind the mercury bead. I opt to use, myself, I really like the peacock eyes in comparison to the herl itself. And it allows you to size it up. If you look at this piece of peacock herl here, if we look down on the bottom, there is, like some 24s, and as we progress up the stem itself, you can see we'll get up into the 18. So it's kind of odd that Mother Nature actually sized the herl for you, but that's one thing that I like about that particular way of choosing your peacock herl. So what we'll do here is we'll take a piece of peacock herl, and if you analyze the actual material itself and you look at the butt end of this versus the tip is going to be a lot more flexible. The stalk is much wider on the back end of this, so that when you're wrapping that forward, you're going to mash down the fibers. So that's why I like to use the tip. For those two reasons right there, we'll tie this in right behind the, try that again, that didn't work out so good. And then we're going to take and just palmer that forward. With several wraps. Take a couple material locking wraps there. And then what I like to do is take a Sharpie pen and color my thread black. And then I'm going to put a whip finish on there. And we'll have our completed fly. So very simple, very effective, little bloodworm imitation. So those are the two larvas that I would recommend, is that pale olive larva and then the red larva. Certainly not the only patterns that you would carry in your tailwater box, but certainly two good starting points. Now as we move into the intermediate stage of a midge's life cycle, what I would do is definitely familiarize yourself with the life cycle of a midge, which is the larva, the pupa, and the adult. The interesting thing about midges is what they lack in size, they make up in numbers. So they have consistent hatches day in and day out on our tail races, anywhere from 3 to 5 broods per calendar year. So it's amazing how much midge activity takes place on our stream. So we just did the larva, now we're going to move into the pupa. So when do you decide you're going to fish a pupa? Well, as soon as you start to see adults visually buzzing around the stream, that should be a signal to you that you should start fishing pupa. Now, the larva doesn't really require any sophisticated tactics and techniques with regard to fishing them. You typically dredge them down near the substrate where the greatest concentrations are found. Pupa, on the other hand, is a lot more difficult because you have to fish them mid-column. You have to have the right amount of weight and the right amount of depth to be successful. So this is one of my favorite flies here. It's called the Top Secret Midge, and it's going to use 2 different colors of thread for the body. This is a Tiemco 2488, and I would tie this in sizes 18 down to a 24. In the Rockies, oftentimes this time of year, you'll see the big spring midge, which is about a size 18, and then the normal midge that you'll encounter day in and day out is usually somewhere between a size 22 and a 26. So that's why I would carry a wide range of sizes in this particular fly, as well as any other pupa. So to review, 2488, size 18 to 26. This is dark brown 8/0 uni thread for the tying thread, and the rib here is going to be a 6/0 white uni thread. I'm going to take this and advance this white tying thread right back towards hook bend, once again with very symmetrical wraps, and then advancing this forward to try to keep a nice smooth abdomen. When I first designed this fly, I wanted to create a fly that was easy to tie but had that segmented body that looked similar to like a peacock quill. The problem with a quill body is they're not as durable as a good thread body, and that's why this pattern came about. So I'm not going to counter rib this fly, but I'm going to actually take this material now and rib it forward. And hopefully on the monitor it looks somewhat quill-like. So think about this for a minute. You really have the flexibility to tie a wide range of sizes and a wide range of colors with this pattern. You could use black and white, that's a nice one. We see a chartreuse midge on the South Platte River, real bright green, so you could use chartreuse and black. Really, your imagination is where this stops. You can tie a wide range of different colors. But I can tell you the key on this is to make sure that you use a different piece of thread for each fly that you tie. Does that make sense? So don't reuse the piece that you've used previously, because by handling the thread it spreads it out and you won't get a nice clean segmentation. So it's important. What I do here is I keep my thread on a bobbin, and that way I'm pulling off a 6 or an 8 or 10-inch piece. It hasn't been handled, and it's going to create a nice clean segmented body. The wing on this pattern, I think, is what really makes this pattern fish so well, and it's a material called Glamour Madura. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of it or not, but it's actually an embroidery thread, and it's great for emerging midge patterns and good for emerging mayfly patterns as well. So you should be able to find it at a local craft store around here, Hobby Lobby, Joann Fabric, something like that. If not, you can find it online, but it's called Glamour Madura. So I'm going to take 2 pieces of this Glamour Madura, and I'm going to secure them into place right here. And then I'm going to take a piece of fine and dry, super fine, rusty brown dubbing. Now, we talked about how the larvae are very uniform throughout their body. Pupa, on the other hand, have a swollen thorax that contains the wings and the legs of the emerging adult. We also talked about the importance of drifting this mid-column. So once I see the adults visually flying around, then I'm going to go down to a number 6 split shot. I typically am a fan of a yarn indicator, and I can adjust that very easily up and down on an orthodontic rubber band, keeping it 1.5 to 2 times the depth of the current. That's my general rule of thumb. Too much weight and you can actually be fishing underneath the fish. Does that make sense? So with pupa, you have to be very, very careful with the amount of weight that you use. So now we're going to take a little bit of this super fine. There's a lot of dubbings available. I like the super fine dubbings because they don't have the guard hairs in it. It's just much easier to control and much easier to use them. And get that defined accuracy and that beautiful little tapered football look in that thorax. So we're going to create this little dubbing noodle here, and we can advance this right back towards the wing. Like I said, just a nice little football shape, and then we're going to whip finish that off. Snip that, and then probably the most important thing here is to pull that forward. I'm going to trim that wing off. And then I'm going to frizz that wing out just like that. And you can see how now that's just a little emerging wing. It's got a little dash of flash, like those mercury patterns. You can fish this under an indicator, which I do traditionally that we talked about a moment ago. But you can also fish this in the film too with the greased leader technique. So that's another strategy that would work very, very well with this particular fly. So again, this is the top secret midge. Now let's move into an adult pattern. There's obviously a lot of different adult patterns that you can fish, and obviously you need to be prepared to fish adults on any of our tailwater fisheries. Typically, you're going to see adults, and you're going to also see clusters. So we see 2 of them. You go up on the bighorn this time of year, you're going to see some big cluster imitations. So I think one of my favorite flies, and it's an oldie but a goodie, is the Griffith gnat, because it can imitate individual midges in a small size, like a 22 or a 24, but tied in a 14 or 16, it can imitate a cluster of midges. So it's a very, very versatile fly from that standpoint. So I'm going to tie this on a size 18. So this could be a little bit of a crossover pattern here. And I'm also going to tie it in a high-vis variation. The beautiful thing about this is if you tie this pattern heavily hackled, you can also fish a dropper off it, like a tungsten mercury black beauty or a tungsten black beauty that just kind of goes on, poison tongue, all kinds of things like that. But I'm just going to show you how there's some different options with this fly as we go along here. So the first thing I'm going to do is tie in a post. You can use a Darlon, you can use some McFly and you can really use whatever color you like. My favorite is some sort of a cerise or hot pink, and that allows me to see this fly in foam mats. It allows me to see it in bubble lines, in seams that can be very difficult, high glare situations, and so on and so forth. So this is a TMCO 101, which is a straight eye dry fly hook, and we're going to begin with some 8/0 uni thread with a jam knot. We're going to come back to about the 3/4 point on our hook shank here, and we're going to tie in this piece of cerise Darlon here, and we'll cut off the butt ends of that and then anchor those down. And then very similar to if you were going to tie a parachute pattern, you're going to make a thread wedge in front of the post here. And you can also bundle these up if you opt to do so here. I tie another little pattern that I really like called a high-vis batis, which would be very similar to this. I would just tie in a blue dun tail, dub the body, and then parachute hackle it. Okay, so that's a nice way to tie a high-vis parachute mayfly imitation with all the same goals in mind as far as the high glare and foam line situations. But moving back into the Griffith gnat, have you guys ever seen a cluster of midges on the water? It's pretty amazing. There'll be times when just a little piece about the size of popcorn will break off the main cluster, and a fish will come up and grab the whole cluster. It's pretty amazing. So we're going to take a couple strands of peacock curl once again and tie them in tip first. 2 strands there, and then we're going to come back with a piece of grizzly hackle here. I'm going to try to find an 18. This is such a beautiful neck. It's sometimes hard to find anything that big on it. So we're going to tie a conventional dry fly style here, which means we're going to tie this so that the dull side is up. We're going to tie this in rearward here on the hook, advance our thread forward. And we all know the power of peacock. Peacock's an amazing material. It's just got that translucency, the flash, it breathes. It's an amazing pattern. So we're going to take these 2 strands of peacock, and it's fairly fluffy here. And you can see that as I advance that forward, move the wing out of the way there. Take a couple material locking wraps in front, a couple in back, trim that off. Now, we talked a moment ago about the hackling of this. You can hackle it sparse if you'd like to, or you can hackle it heavy if you like to. I usually choose the latter. I like to hackle these very heavily. That way, if I opt to use a dropper off it, I have that extra high flotation. I'm going to move that forward. I'm going to take 2 wraps behind the hackle, 2 in front of it. And once again, we're going to trim that off, and then we'll whip finish. And then the final thing here is just to trim that wing off. Trim that wing off, and then I kind of mash that down. So very simple, very effective. Like I said, you can fish it for an individual midge in small sizes, cluster in big sizes. You can really vary the wing. If you can see chartreuse better, go with chartreuse. If you can see black better, go with black. You don't even need to use a wing. You can tie it with a standard Griffith gnat, or you can tie it with a high-vis variation. So again, there's a lot of variations that can occur there. So then we went through, we had a couple different larvae. We have a pupa and adult, and certainly those are kind of good oldies, but standby patterns that'll work very, very well on just about any tailwater fishery. Now let's move into some mayfly patterns. Obviously, this time of year, it's very exciting for us as tailwater enthusiasts because we're starting to see the first mayflies of the year hatching, the Baetis mayflies, the blue-wing olives. And so typically like mid to late March, the trout that have been overwintering in the slow deep pools, the ones that have been feeding almost exclusively on midges, now are starting to wake up a little bit. Generally the first week of April, spring has sprung and we're starting to see consistent blue-wing olive hatches every afternoon between 1 and 3 o'clock. One thing that's important to understand is that riffle fish are feeding fish. So now fish that are starting to move into the transitional zones and back into the riffles are going to be those fish that are actively feeding. So I'm going to tie a couple patterns that I think are must-haves on any western tailwater. One of those is a RS2 and one of those is a pheasant tail. Now I got to find where I just put my size 18 Timco hook. So one of the beautiful things about this pattern, this is a Mercury pheasant tail, so it's a variation of Frank Sawyer's original pattern, which dates back to 1929. It's an oldie but a goodie, and in so many different variations. You can tie it just a standard pheasant tail. You can tie it with a gold bead. If you want to increase your sink rate, you use a tungsten bead. If you want to keep it a little bit slimmer in profile with just a dash of flash, then you can use this little Mercury variation as well. So the pheasant tail is going to imitate a wide range of mayflies, even possibly some stoneflies in larger sizes. Like if you tie a size 18 black pheasant tail, it's the perfect winter stonefly nymph, okay? And if you tie it in a 16, it's a nice little yellow Sally. So keep in mind that if you go by upsizing it, you can have some stonefly variations as well. But typically for your mayflies, size 16 down to about a 24. You can vary the coloration of it from a ginger, which would be a nice pale morning dun nymph, right down into olive for Baetis, red quills, so on and so forth, trico nymphs. I mean, really, again, your imagination and is going to make this an unlimited possibility with regard to mayfly nymph. So this is a Timco 101, size 18, and I've got an extra small glass bead on there, the Mercury bead. And we're going to begin with a jam knot, back about hook point there. And we're going to take a few strands of pheasant tail fibers here. I try to keep this pattern as thin and as sparse as possible. And so I'm going to use 4 fibers off of this tail to tie the entire fly with. So what I'll do here is I'll take 4 of these pheasant tail fibers. I'm going to make sure that I'm going to pull them off at a 90-degree angle, transfer the material in my fingers, and I'm going to tie in my tail. I'm going to adjust the tail here. Typically on my nymphs, my tails, I like them to be about 2/3 of a shank length long. That's the equation that you want to use for that. I'm going to use a little bit of gold wire for the ribbing on this. And I like the extra fine Lagarton wire on this, which is a fine wire with a varnished coating over it. And what we're trying to accomplish here with this ribbing is a little bit of added durability. I'm going to take 2 turns here, 2 turns here to catch that other piece of wire, and then I'm going to advance this thread forward. I'm going to take those original grouping of pheasant tail fibers and then just start advancing those forward. Again, with the goal being to keep that body as thin and sparse as possible. We're going to counter rib the gold wire to create a little bit of segmentation, as well as the durability that we mentioned a moment ago. Probably one of the biggest things to a pheasant tail is the lack of durability. If a brown trout tooth drags across the abdomen, it's going to break. But this is going to really help that out a lot. It's an easy fly to tie, so if it falls apart, it's not that big of a deal. So we got these 4 original fibers. I'm going to put 2 on the front side and 2 on the rearward side of this hook. And then I'm going to put in a piece of mylar tinsel for the wing case. Again, the option would be to tie a standard variation of this, or you can tie a flashback variation of this. So I'm going to tie this mylar tinsel in. You can use UTC, or you can use Danville. This happens to be Danville here. And I'm going to tie that in so that it's about halfway on the hook shank there. What you'll find in a lot of cases when you're doing wing cases is that the wing pad, when you pull it forward, is going to creep just a little bit. So make sure that your proportions are right halfway in the middle there. Then we're going to take, again, a little bit of peacock curl. And this is where you can use your discretion on this. Think about beta nymphs. I mean, beta nymphs should be very thin and very sparse. They're very streamlined. They're swimmers. Okay, so their variation should be tied appropriately. Now, moving into some of your other mayflies like pale morning duns and tricos, they have much more of a chunky appearance. Okay, so you can really do whatever you want with regard to the thorax on this particular pattern. I generally tie it just a little bit thicker than most because, again, I'm kind of relying on this peacock. I'm going to tie that in tip first like we've discussed here a moment ago. And then I'm going to take a few turns here, usually about 7 turns, forward up towards the eye there. I'm going to take 2 material locking wraps there. Pull my wing pad right over the top here. I've got those kind of separated there. Take a couple material locking wraps there. Trim off the excess material and then do a whip finish. So a great little mayfly pattern. You can dredge this down near the substrate, or you can fish it mid-column. Both are acceptable. Typically, okay, we're going to trim the legs off here. Typically, when I start to see some mayflies emerging, then I'm going to start to begin to adjust where I'm fishing this particular pattern in the water column. So, very simple pattern, mercury pheasant tail again, and a wide range of sizes to imitate both some stoneflies and mayflies. Another pattern that I think is critical for success, and I'm sure you guys have heard of it, is an RS2. The river that I guide on most of the time is the South Platte and Cheeseman Canyon. So very technical river, and this pattern was actually born downstream in an area referred to as Deckers. I'm not sure how many of you guys get to Colorado and fish the Deckers and Cheeseman Canyon section of the South Platte, but if you haven't, it should be on your bucket list of things to do. It's a great fishery, very technical fishery. The beautiful thing about a tailwater, whether you're fishing the Bighorn, the Green, the South Platte, or the San Juan, a tailwater is a tailwater, so they pretty much all act the same. Certainly there's some nuances of each fishery, but for the most part, they pretty much all fish the same. So this pattern here was invented by Rim Chung, and it stands for Rim's Semblance Number 2. The original pattern, the RS1, was just a mayfly nymph, and then he came up with the RS2, which is the emerger. So we'd be fishing this during the height of a Baetis emergence. So we're going to begin here with some 8/0 uni thread, and we're going to tie in a tail out of dun hackle fibers. And what I typically do is just use some of the spay hackles that on the edge of the neck for the tailing material here. You can use a moose, you could use goose biots, you can go as far as splitting the tails. But what I found as a commercial tyer that the faster that I can tie this pattern and the easier that I can tie this pattern, the better off that I'm going to be. So I'm going to take a clump of fibers here, and I'm going to tie those in just like I would do with a dry fly. Not that I'm going to use that tail to support this pattern, but it's just going to emulate the mayfly tails, okay? Probably, again, one of the most important attributes to an RS2 and tying a good RS2 is going to be keeping this fly, very thin and very sparse. Bulky patterns certainly are not going to fish nearly as well as very thin and very sparse patterns. So what we'll do here is we're going to take some fine and dry once again. And we're going to take just a few fibers to create this dubbing loop here. And really the back end of this is not much thicker than the thread. And then we're going to advance this forward and we're going to try to create a slight taper, nothing too dramatic here. Hopefully, is the monitor showing a slight taper there? Good. Then probably the most important part of this is the wing. And this is a material called pearl braid. And this is what really makes this pattern fish well. This is nothing more than a group of crystal flash fibers interwoven into a flat braid. So we're going to tie a big flat loop wing here. We're going to tie this in. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull that material forward, scoot that back to create the wing, and tie in my loop wing just like this. And then I'm going to come in with a super sharp pair of scissors. Try to avoid cutting off that wing there. Then I'll secure the tie-in point there. And see how we've got that emerging wing. So this is a beautiful thing. This is right at the tail end of the emergence of a mayfly. Keep in mind, like the pheasant tail, we can tie this in a wide range of sizes, from a 16 down to a 24, in a wide range of colors. We can tie it in brown, we can tie it in black, we can tie it in olive, we can tie it in PMD to imitate any of those mayflies that you'll encounter on your favorite tailwater. Then we're going to start here. I'm going to advance this back right towards the wing there. Then I'll advance that back forward. And then we're going to whip finish that off. So again, very simple, very effective pattern. This is a pattern that you can dead drift it mid-column. Certainly allow it to swing in the water column on the end of your drift, because what will happen a lot of times is when that swings and starts to rise to the surface, this protruding wing right here is going to cause that fly to swing and swim on the rise. Oftentimes fish are eating the betas from that wiggling motion as they're rising to the surface film. So a lot of times you'll get the strike on the end. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll do a position set at the end of the drift before I recast it back up. So that's the RS2, great little mayfly pattern. Trying to keep an eye on the time here, guys, so I don't get into the next tires. I think we got enough room here to do a little caddis pattern that I like to fish. So as we start to get into the May time frame, May and June, we start to see some caddis activity. The interesting thing about caddis in a tailwater situation is they occur much later in the year than on our freestone streams. Typically, like the brachiocentrus caddis that we see on some of our freestone streams in the Rocky Mountains, tend to hatch around Mother's Day, and that's why it's dubbed as the Mother's Day caddis hatch. In our tail race situations, typically it takes much longer for the water to warm up. Does that make sense? Because a lot of times it's coming off the bottom, a lot of times it's in the 40-degree range. Caddis need that 52 to 54-degree range to pupate. So it takes later into the season before we start to see that occur. One of the interesting things, though, however, is there's always exceptions to the rule. And like in my home river, and it won't be the case this year because our snowpack is so down. I'm not sure what your guys' pack is here, but we're in a drought on the other side of the hill here. We're at about 66% snowpack on the South Platte corridor. So we're not going to see our reservoir spill this year. Oftentimes, if our reservoir spills, then we have warmer surface water that's coming over the top, mixing with the water on the bottom, and then that can jump that water temperature up and can trigger some of our caddis hatches to occur earlier in the year. But that's not going to be the case on this season. So this is a Tiemco 200R. And instead of using the extra small bead, I'm going to use a small bead here. So what I'm going to attempt to tie here is what I call the mercury caddis. And this is just a little brachycentrus caddis. I'm sure in past you have caught one of these little twigs, one of these little cased caddises on the end of your fly, and if you squeeze them, inside the little larva is actually inside of the casing itself. Now what's interesting is these guys become victims of behavioral drift. So if they become overcrowded in a certain area, they're going to move to another location. If we get a small increase in flow, they're going to move. They might get dislodged. So fish will root them off branches, root them off rocks, so on and so forth. We're going to begin with some 8/0 tan thread. Let's see if I can get this re-threaded here. We'll begin about mid-shank, and then we're going to use some hare's mask dubbing for the casing, and we're going to use some ice dub for the larva inside the casing, and then some black hare's mask for the head. Just like a hare's ear, I think one of the most important attributes to this pattern is making it look buggy. So what I do is I typically prefer, when I'm using a hare's mask dubbing of any sort, rather than buying a pre-made package of it off the shelf, I prefer to mix my own up. So I have a coffee grinder on my fly tying table, and then I'll get a hare's mask, and then I can control the amount of underfur that I put in my dubbing and the amount of guard hairs that I put in my dubbing. And I typically like a very spiky, very healthy amount of guard hairs in this particular pattern, as I do, as I mentioned, on my hare's ear. The buggier the better. And that's a little bit more on the challenging side with regard to dubbing, and if you prefer, you can use some wax with this. We're going to start right back towards the rearward part of that hook, and then we're going to start moving forward here. And I typically will dub this in 2 or 3 different layers to try to accomplish the taper to this fly. I'm going to add just a little bit more. Some of those guard hairs sticking out on the monitor, can you see?
Oh, yeah.
So we're going to come up to right about here, and I'm going to advance the thread back forward, and we'll come back in with another layer. And then we'll start a little bit in front of that point there, and then just, again, try to establish a little bit more taper. Just like that. Now we'll take a little bit of the dubbing, as I mentioned, to make the larva. And this is going to be the trigger on this particular pattern. A lot of times the fish will key on the actual chartreuse looking larva. We're going to take a little bit of that dubbing right there and put that right in front of the casing. So sometimes you'll hear people refer to these as peaking caddis. And then we'll take a little bit of the hare's mask dubbing, and then dub that right behind the mercury bead there. So if you look at caddis, one of the prominent features with them is the black head. You'll notice that I used tan thread, and that's so that you won't see the thread in the actual dubbing process. And like what I did with the mercury blood midge, I'll come back in with my Sharpie. I'm going to color my thread here black, so it'll blend right in with that head. Now what I do for a tungsten variation of this fly is I'm going to swap a 2.8 tungsten bead for this dubbing. So what I'll do is I'll put the mercury bead on first. I'm going to take a tungsten bead and I'm going to turn it backwards so that the countersunk side is going to butt right up with the bead. Does that make sense? Because when you look at a tungsten bead, or a brass bead for that matter, there's a small side and a big side. So if you turn it backwards, you slide it up. So now you got the merc bead, you'd have your tungsten bead sitting here, and then you would tie this fly exactly the same. So that gives you a standard mercury bead, caddis, and then the tungsten variation as well. So I'm going to wrap it up with that fly because it's almost 5 till, and I don't think I'm going to be able to get another fly done by 11 o'clock when I'm supposed to be out of here. So I'm going to be tying flies over at the Blue Quill Angler booth all day, and you can stop by, say hello. If there's anything you want to see a little closer, we can tie them up. I've got all my books and all that stuff over there, and certainly by any means, if I can help in any way, please don't hesitate to yell at us. Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity.